My name is Tori, and this is another Words in the World production. So today I'll be talking to you about metaphors again. So this video is actually level 2, so I'll be talking about classic theories right now. There is a level 1 video that just is a basic introduction to metaphors. If you haven't watched it yet, you might want to take a look, just because we'll be using some of the information from that first video in today's video. So just as a recap, when we're talking about metaphors, metaphors are usually in a A is B format. So the A is the topic, the B is the vehicle, and the meaning that we derive from it is called the ground. Also remember that even though they're usually in an A is B format, so using our classic example, my lawyer is a shark, it can also be in a compound format. So instead of my lawyer is a shark, it can be a shark lawyer as well. So just a quick overview of what we'll be talking about for classic theories today. These are classic theories, so they're not necessarily completely used in research today, but they do at least inform the kind of research we do today, and they do have some background knowledge that helps explain some of the theories that we are using right now. So we'll be talking about the comparison theory, and then we'll be talking about the mapping theory, and then after that we'll be talking about something that's a little combination of both. So the comparison theory, when we're talking about the comparison theory, we do need to understand some of the underlying assumptions. One of the main ones is that it's a two-process theory. So the comparison theory understands that first, when we encounter a metaphor, we read it as, or understand it, literally. So when we have my lawyer is a shark, we understand that in a literal sense first, and then once we realize that that isn't a literal statement, it's only then that we compute it into a figurative language. The other thing that we have to understand from the comparison theory is that it believes that metaphors are distinct from our everyday literal language, that there's something special about them. So the comparison theory is actually that metaphors are processed as a simile. So when we said it was a two-process theory, that first we compute it literally and then we compute it as a figurative language, what it's actually saying is that when it's not a literal language, we immediately move to the simile form. So still figurative, but still literal in a way. So my lawyer is a shark becomes lawyer is like a shark. And in that way, that's how we understand it, and instead of using it as a non-literal language. So some problems arise immediately from this. Firstly, how do we actually still know the similarities? So despite it being in a more literal language format, so this simile format, my lawyer is like a shark, how do we still come up with the similarities? How do we still come up with the meaning of that? So how do we know to what degree are the similarities relevant? Also, what it doesn't take into account is dissimilarities between the topic and vehicle. And one thing is in this case, because the similes are more literal language than the metaphor is, do metaphors actually take longer to process than similes? And the answer sometimes is no. So the research shows that this is maybe not the case. So because there's still some problems with that, we'll move on to the next classic theory, which is mapping. Mapping was first introduced by Lakoff. And once again, we do have to understand some of the underlying assumptions before we get into the theory. Some of those underlying assumptions are that instead of, like the comparison theory, first computing a literal and then figurative language, that we first actually interpret the metaphoric meaning. And then, again, comparing it to the comparison theory, metaphor is actually believed to be part of everyday speech. And that does seem to be true, that we do use metaphors in everyday life, and they're still understood by everyone we're talking to. Mapping is actually part of an interaction theory. So it compares the topic, the vehicle, and from both of those, it then creates the emergent meaning. So mapping uses these broad categories that are believed to be part of our fixed conceptual system. So it takes broad categories such as love is a journey, and it takes any metaphor that's related to that and maps it onto the broad category. So you can have metaphors like their relationship is bumpy, they have a rocky road ahead of them, that type of thing can be mapped onto this larger broad category of love is a journey. And that's how we take some of the more novel metaphors and understand them. The problem, however, is that it doesn't address very novel metaphors. So although we can have some metaphors like their relationship hit a fork in the road, we can still map that onto Love's journey, even if it's maybe not as conventional. It doesn't talk about or doesn't have a way to explain extremely novel metaphors. The other problem is that it's a very circular reasoning, so these broad categories that are part of our conceptual system are put there because we have encountered so many metaphors that they've created this category. But how do we understand the metaphors if we don't have this broad category to begin with? And yet again, what aspects are actually mapped? So how do we know what parts of these metaphors are mapped onto the bigger one? So it might be a little discouraging looking at these two classic theories and thinking, well, neither of them explain enough to be a good theory. And this is where our next set comes in. It's actually a combinatory type of theory that uses both mapping and comparison. So that is that conventional metaphors are use mapping to be understood. So we have these broad categories that we take some of these more conventional metaphors and are able to map onto the broad category, whereas the more novel metaphors are actually being comprehended using the comparison theory. Still, this doesn't explain everything, so again, this is why they're called classic theories. There are some better ones in the literature right now, but at least this gives you some information about the basics, or at least where metaphor research first began. So some questions that you might have now at the end of this is, what theory actually fits metaphor comprehension the best? Is there one that fits everything? Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. Does the time course matter? So if we maybe compute the metaphoric meaning first, do we maybe compute the literal later still? And what does the actual current research support? Because the two that we've discussed here, the classic theories, or the three that we've discussed here, these classic theories, don't actually work with the literature at the moment, so what does the current literature use at the moment? And again, is there differences between novel and conventional metaphors? It seems like maybe perhaps they're processed differently. Is there one theory that fits both, or do we have to use different ones for different types of metaphors? So just a quick summary, we did talk about the comparison theory, so metaphors being computed as a literal statement, so in simile form. Or then we talked about the mapping theory, so these broad categories such as love is a journey and our metaphors being mapped onto these broad categories. And then a combinatory theory of both, where conventional maybe is processed as a mapping and novel is processed using the comparison theory. And so that's the end of today's video. So maybe there is some future videos talking about current theories and the experiments that go along with them. But thank you for watching today.